The sun dipped low over the quiet suburban road as Angela Brooks drove home after a long day at work. Her dark blue sedan glided smoothly past tree-lined streets. She wasn't speeding, her seatbelt was on, and the only sound was soft jazz playing through the speakers. Then suddenly, flashing red and blue lights lit up her rearview mirror. Angela frowned, glancing at her speedometer. 35 miles per hour, exactly the limit. She signaled and carefully pulled over to the side of the road. Behind her, the patrol car rolled to a stop. The officer stepped out slowly, his boots crunching against the gravel shoulder. Officer Grant, tall and broad, with mirrored sunglasses that reflected the fading sun. Angela rolled down her window halfway, her hands resting calmly on the wheel, just like she had been taught. "Good evening, officer," she said politely. "Is there a problem?" Grant didn't return the greeting. He tilted his head, scanning the inside of her car, as if searching for something. "License and registration," he demanded. Angela nodded. "Of course. May I ask why I'm being stopped?" "You failed to signal back there," Grant said flatly. Angela blinked. "I signaled before my last turn. I'm sure Don't argue with me," he interrupted sharply. "License, now." Angela kept her tone calm. "I'm not arguing. I just don't understand the reason for the stop." Grant leaned closer to the window, his smirk unmistakable. "Step out of the vehicle." Angela froze. "Step out? Why? I've done nothing wrong." "I said out of the car," Grant barked. His hand hovered near his holster, not touching it, but close enough to send a message. A knot formed in Angela's stomach, but she stayed composed. Slowly, she opened the door and stepped out, with her hands visible. Grant circled the car, his eyes sweeping over her with thinly veiled disdain. "Where are you headed?" "Home, from work," Angela replied evenly. "What do you do for work?" "I work for the state," she said carefully. Grant chuckled. "Sure you do." He gestured toward her car. "Mind if I search it?" "Yes," Angela said firmly. "I do mind. And unless you have probable cause, you can't." Grant's smirk widened. "You people always know your rights, don't you?" The words hit her like a slap. You people. A couple walking their dog slowed nearby, pulling out their phones. Another driver stopped on the opposite side of the road, recording quietly through his open window. Angela's voice stayed calm, but now there was steel behind it. "Officer, I strongly suggest you think very carefully about your next move." Grant scoffed. "Oh yeah? Or what? You gonna file a complaint? Let me guess. You know someone at City Hall?" Angela didn't flinch. She reached into her jacket pocket slowly, deliberately, and pulled out a slim leather wallet. With one smooth motion, she opened it and held it up so he couldn't miss it. The badge gleamed in the light. State Attorney Angela Brooks. Grant's smirk disappeared instantly. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Angela tilted her head slightly, her calm now sharper than any raised voice. "Congratulations, officer," she said evenly. "You just unlawfully detained and attempted to intimidate the wrong person." For a split second, the world around them went silent. The soft hum of traffic faded, and even the dog walkers nearby stopped whispering. Officer Grant's confident posture wilted as his eyes scanned the gold seal on the badge in Angela's hand. State Attorney Angela Brooks. He blinked, unsure what to say. "You're a state attorney?" Angela's gaze didn't waver. Yes, and you just unlawfully stopped and harassed me without cause. Grant's partner, still by the patrol car, froze when he heard those words. His eyes darted nervously between his superior and Angela, clearly realizing the magnitude of what was happening. I, uh, Grant stammered, his earlier bravado evaporating. This was a routine stop. Angela tilted her head, her voice calm but razor sharp. Routine? You pulled me over for a fabricated reason, demanded I exit my vehicle, and made racially charged remarks in front of witnesses. That's not routine. That's abuse of power. Murmurs rippled through the small crowd now gathered on the sidewalk. Phones remained raised, recording every second. Grant tried to recover. Ma'am, I think there's been a misunderstanding. No, Angela interrupted, her tone firm but even. There's no misunderstanding. I know exactly what you did. She stepped closer, lowering her voice so only he could hear, but the weight of her words was undeniable. You picked the wrong person today, and worse, you did it in front of cameras. The couple with the dog caught that last line. Yeah, we got all of this on video, the woman called out. Every word. Grant's face turned pale. He glanced back at his partner, who avoided eye contact. Angela straightened, addressing the bystanders. Please make sure you keep those recordings safe. They may be needed later. The crowd nodded. Some even stepped closer, holding out their phones as if to make sure Grant understood there was no way out. Officer, Angela said, her voice now carrying across the road. Call your sergeant right now. Grant hesitated. Ma'am, I don't think. Call your sergeant, Angela repeated, her tone cutting through the tension like a blade. Grant's partner finally stepped in, speaking nervously. I'll radio him, ma'am. Within minutes, another patrol car pulled up. A sergeant stepped out, his expression already tense. What's going on here? Angela turned toward him calmly. What's going on is your officer unlawfully detained me, attempted to search my car without cause, and made racially derogatory comments, all while being recorded by multiple witnesses. The sergeant's face tightened. He glanced at Grant, who stood rigid and silent, his sunglasses hiding nothing anymore. Is that true? The sergeant asked sharply. Grant opened his mouth but couldn't speak. Yes, it's true, someone from the crowd shouted. We all saw it. The sergeant exhaled slowly, clearly knowing the situation was beyond salvaging. Ma'am, I deeply apologize. We'll handle this immediately. Angela didn't flinch. You won't just handle it. You'll document it, report it, and expect a formal complaint filed with your Internal Affairs Division by the end of the day. And I'll be forwarding copies of all video evidence to the State Ethics Committee. The sergeant nodded grimly. Understood. Grant finally tried to speak, his voice small. I didn't know who you were. Angela's eyes narrowed. That's the problem. You should treat everyone with respect, not just the people you think can fight back. The crowd erupted in quiet agreement, murmuring affirmations. Angela turned back to her car, her posture calm but powerful. We're done here. I'll see you in a more appropriate setting. Court. She got back into her vehicle, closing the door with quiet finality. As she pulled away, the crowd continued recording. Grant stood frozen by the roadside, his career unraveling in real time. Because in one moment, the power he thought he held had been stripped away, not by shouting, but by the simple, undeniable weight of truth. By the next morning, the incident was everywhere. The videos recorded by bystanders had gone viral overnight. Social media feeds were flooded with clips of Officer Grant barking orders, yanking Angela out of her car, and then freezing when she revealed her state attorney badge. Headlines spread like wildfire. Black woman harassed in traffic stop reveals she's a state attorney. Officer tries to intimidate wrong person, caught on camera. News anchors dissected every second of the footage. Commentators debated the systemic issues it exposed, and in the comment sections, thousands of people demanded accountability. At the precinct, the atmosphere was tense. Officers huddled in small groups, whispering. Some stared at the news reports playing on the break room TV, their faces unreadable. Others muttered under their breath. "Did you see the video?" one asked. Quietly, "Yeah. Grant's done. There's no coming back from that." In the chief's office, the tone was sharper. The sergeant from the scene had already filed a preliminary report, and now the chief sat across from Grant, who looked pale and defeated. "Do you understand what you've done?" the chief asked coldly. Grant shifted in his chair. "I didn't know who she was, and that's supposed to make it better?" The chief cut him off. "You unlawfully detained a driver. You tried to intimidate her. You made a racially charged comment. On camera. With witnesses. It doesn't matter who she was. You violated protocol and the law." Grant stayed silent, realizing nothing he said could erase the footage now being replayed across the entire state. Meanwhile, at her office, Angela was already preparing her formal complaint. She sat at her desk calmly, gathering the bystanders' videos, drafting her statement, and contacting the Internal Affairs Division. She didn't rush or shout. She simply documented every detail with the precision of someone who knew the system inside out. Her phone buzzed with messages from colleagues and other attorneys. Some expressed outrage. Others offered support. One message from a fellow state attorney read, "You handled that perfectly. Let me know if you need backup on the legal side. This can't be swept under the rug." Meanwhile, the community was rallying. Local activists organized a press conference on the courthouse steps. Angela didn't attend. She didn't want to make it about herself. But she watched from her office window as residents held signs reading, "Justice for all, not just for some," and "Abuse of power ends now." Back at the precinct, Grant's partner, Officer Mills, was called in for questioning. "Mills," the investigator asked, "did you witness Grant's actions?" Mills hesitated, then nodded. "Yes." He escalated without cause. She complied. There was no reason to pull her out of the car. "And did you hear the comment he made?" "Yes." Mills swallowed hard. He said, "You people always know your rights." The investigator wrote it down carefully. "Thank you. That's all for now." Across the city, Angela returned home that evening to a flood of supportive emails and messages. Jaylen, her nephew visiting for dinner, looked up from his phone. "Auntie, you're everywhere. People are calling you a hero." Angela smiled faintly, but shook her head. "I'm not a hero. I just refuse to be silent. The real heroes are the people who recorded it and made sure the truth couldn't be ignored." Meanwhile, Grant sat alone in his apartment, blinds drawn, his phone buzzing relentlessly with messages he didn't dare read. His neighbors had seen the footage. His name was trending for all the wrong reasons. And for the first time, the badge he had once worn like armor felt like nothing more than a memory of a power he no longer had. Because the truth, once exposed, doesn't just strip away lies. It dismantles the illusion they were built on. By the end of the week, the viral video had sparked a storm far larger than anyone anticipated. Local news stations were holding live debates on police accountability. National outlets picked up the story, framing it as yet another example of power misused. Angela's calm confrontation was replayed on loop, a quiet but undeniable reminder of what happens when the wrong person is underestimated. At City Hall, the mayor called an emergency press conference. Flanked by community leaders and the police chief, he spoke gravely. "This incident is unacceptable," the mayor said. "Effective immediately, Officer Grant is placed on unpaid suspension pending a full investigation. The city is committed to full transparency and accountability. We cannot and will not tolerate abuse of power." Reporters shouted questions, but the mayor didn't stay long. He knew the public was already demanding more than words. They wanted action. Meanwhile, at the precinct, Grant sat in a conference room surrounded by internal affairs investigators. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead as a recorder clicked on. "Officer Grant," the lead investigator began, "you're aware we have multiple recordings of your traffic stop with State Attorney Angela Brooks?" Grant nodded stiffly. "In those recordings, you can be seen detaining her without clear probable cause, using aggressive language, and making a racially derogatory remark. Do you dispute the validity of this evidence?" Grant hesitated, his voice low. "No." The investigator leaned back in his chair. "You understand this isn't just a departmental violation. It's a civil rights violation. You've exposed this department to lawsuits and public backlash. You've damaged trust that was already fragile." Grant said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Outside the precinct, protesters gathered, holding signs that read, "Respect our rights," and "We won't be silent." Community leaders gave speeches demanding stronger oversight and mandatory bias training for all officers. Inside her office, Angela watched the news coverage while reviewing legal documents. She had already filed her formal complaint, and Internal Affairs confirmed the investigation would proceed with priority. She was also preparing testimony for an upcoming city council hearing on police misconduct. Her phone buzzed with a call from a colleague. "You're making waves," the colleague said. "This case might actually push through some of the reforms we've been talking about for years." Angela sighed. It shouldn't take something like this to make people listen. Across town, Grant's partner, Officer Mills, was quietly cooperating with the investigation. He provided his full statement, confirming that Angela had complied and that Grant had escalated without cause. "I tried to keep my distance because he was my senior," Mills admitted, "but I regret not stepping in. It wasn't right." Meanwhile, the community began organizing more structured efforts. Activists launched a campaign for an independent civilian oversight board with real authority. Petitions circulated online, gathering thousands of signatures in just days. At a town hall meeting, Angela attended quietly at the back. Residents shared their own stories. People who had been pulled over for no reason, treated like suspects simply because of how they looked. A young woman spoke tearfully about her father, who'd been through something similar, but never saw justice. When Angela was asked to speak, she stood and addressed the room with calm authority. "What happened to me was wrong," she said, "but I had the resources, the knowledge, and the badge to defend myself. Most people don't. That's why this can't just end with one investigation. This has to lead to lasting change." The room erupted in applause. Meanwhile, in his apartment, Grant sat staring at the TV. His name crawled across the news ticker as analysts discussed his case. His suspension was now public, and neighbors whispered when he left the building. The power he once wielded so easily had vanished, replaced by silence and shame. Because when the truth comes to light, it doesn't just expose a single act, it forces everyone to see what was always there. The disciplinary hearing was set for the following week, and by then, the tension in the city was palpable. The footage of the stop had been replayed so many times that people knew every second by heart. The aggressive tone, the dismissive sneer, and the moment Angela revealed her badge, flipping the power dynamic in an instant. Outside the police headquarters, a large crowd gathered on the morning of the hearing. Protesters held candles and signs reading "Accountability Now" and "Justice for All." Local news cameras scanned the crowd, capturing the faces of parents, students, and community leaders, all united for one message. This would not be quietly forgotten. Inside, the hearing room was packed with reporters and city officials. Angela arrived in a tailored suit, calm as always. Jaylen, her nephew, sat beside her quietly, watching the room fill with curious stares. Grant entered a few minutes later, escorted by 2 officers. He was no longer the confident figure from the roadside stop. His posture was stiff, his gaze locked on the floor. The chief sat at the head of the long table, flanked by members of the disciplinary board. Papers rustled as the session began. "Officer Grant," the chief said firmly, "you are here today to answer for your actions during the traffic stop of State Attorney Angela Brooks. You have been accused of unlawful detainment, racial bias, and unprofessional conduct. Do you have anything to say before we proceed?" Grant shifted in his seat. "I made a mistake," he muttered. Angela leaned forward slightly, her voice steady but strong. "It wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. A choice you made because you assumed you could intimidate me like you've likely done to countless others. The only difference is this time, the cameras were rolling and you picked the wrong target." A quiet murmur rippled through the audience. Grant's attorney cleared his throat. "My client has already expressed remorse. Remorse after being caught," Angela cut in smoothly. "But what about the others who didn't have the chance to fight back? How many more were there?" The board members exchanged glances. The weight of her words lingered. The internal affairs investigator presented the evidence next: body cam footage, civilian videos, and the transcript of Grant's partner's testimony. It was undeniable. The chief looked directly at Grant. "This department cannot and will not protect misconduct. Effective immediately, you are terminated from the force. Furthermore, this matter will be referred to the district attorney for potential criminal charges." A collective exhale filled the room. The reporters scribbled furiously as cameras clicked. Angela didn't gloat. She simply nodded once, her face calm, before standing to leave. Outside, the crowd erupted into applause when word spread of the decision. Journalists swarmed Angela, but she raised a hand to quiet them. "This isn't just about me," she told the cameras. "It's about every person who has been silenced, dismissed, or mistreated without anyone watching. One termination won't fix everything, but it's a start." The crowd cheered, not with the loudness of celebration, but with the quiet satisfaction of a small step toward justice. Meanwhile, Grant left through a side door, shielded from the press. As he walked alone down the empty hallway, the reality of his fall sank in. The badge he once wielded as a shield was gone, and with it, the illusion of power he had built his life around. Across town, Angela and Jaylen returned home. He looked at her with quiet admiration. "You didn't even yell," he said. Angela smiled faintly. "I didn't need to. The truth was louder than anything I could have said." And in the glow of the setting sun, the city felt just a little bit lighter, even if the road to real change was still long. Because truth doesn't just win, it teaches. In the weeks following the hearing, the ripple effects spread far beyond one officer's termination. The mayor's office announced new reforms: mandatory bias training for every officer, stricter policies on traffic stops, and the creation of an independent civilian oversight board with the authority to review complaints and recommend disciplinary action. The community felt a shift. It wasn't everything, but it was more than they'd had before. At town hall meetings, people who had stayed silent for years were finally speaking out. Parents shared stories of their children being stopped for no reason. Business owners recalled being treated with suspicion in their own neighborhoods. Angela attended one of these meetings quietly. She didn't take the microphone. She just listened. She watched as people's voices grew louder, stronger, realizing they didn't have to fear being ignored anymore. A woman approached her afterward. "I saw the video," she said softly. "It gave me courage to finally tell my story. What you did, it mattered." Angela smiled gently. "What we did mattered. It took everyone. Those who recorded, those who spoke up for afterward. Change doesn't happen alone." Meanwhile, at the precinct, the reforms were making waves. Some officers grumbled about extra oversight, but many, especially the younger recruits, welcomed the change. They didn't want to be part of an institution that shielded misconduct. One rookie officer told his mentor quietly, "I joined this job to help people. I'm glad the culture is shifting. We can't afford another Grant." And speaking of Grant, his world had become painfully small. Stripped of his badge and his reputation, he stayed mostly indoors, avoiding the stares of neighbors who now knew his name for all the wrong reasons. One day, a former colleague called him, not to offer support, but to say, "They're reopening other complaints against you. It's not over." Grant hung up without responding. He knew there was no redemption. The truth was already out, and it would follow him forever. Across town, Angela's life returned to a new normal. She continued her work as a state attorney, but she also quietly mentored young law students and community advocates who wanted to push for systemic change. She never bragged about what happened. She simply used it as a lesson to build something better. Jaylen, meanwhile, was finally able to focus on his life without the shadow of the incident. He returned to his college plans, joined a youth leadership group, and even began volunteering at community centers to talk to kids about knowing their rights. One evening, after a leadership workshop, a young girl approached him. "Were you scared?" she asked softly. Jaylen nodded. "Yeah, I was terrified, but I learned something. Being scared doesn't mean you're weak. It just means you're human. What matters is what you do after the fear." She smiled shyly and hugged him before running off to join her friends. That night, as Angela and Jaylen walked home through the quiet streets, the city lights glowing softly above, he turned to her and asked, "Do you think people will remember this years from now?" "They'll remember the lesson," Angela said, looking ahead. "That power isn't a license to hurt. that the truth always finds its way out, and that even one small act of courage, like speaking up, can change more than you think. Meanwhile, in his dim apartment, Grant sat staring at a stack of unopened mail, lawsuits, official notices, and bills he could no longer pay. He realized the power he thought was permanent had been built on fear, not respect. And fear doesn't last. The truth, however, does. Angela and Jaylen reached home, closing the door behind them with a quiet sense of peace. The road to change was still long, but at least it had begun. Because when the truth steps into the light, it doesn't just expose darkness, it forces everything around it to grow. Months passed, but the echoes of Angela's traffic stop still resonated. The viral video had long stopped trending, yet its impact continued to shape policies and conversations across the state. Cities nearby began adopting similar oversight boards, and new laws requiring transparent reporting on traffic stops were introduced in the legislature. Angela was invited to speak at a statewide summit on criminal justice reform. She stood before an audience of lawmakers, law enforcement leaders, and community advocates. "I didn't ask to become part of this conversation," she began, her voice calm but resolute. "I was simply driving home. But what happened to me revealed a truth that too many people already knew. That power, unchecked, can harm the very people it's supposed to protect. Change doesn't start with speeches. It starts with accountability." The room erupted in applause, but Angela didn't bask in it. She stepped away from the podium, knowing there was still so much more work to do. Back in the city, Jaylen's life was steadily returning to normal. He focused on his studies and continued volunteering at youth programs. One Saturday morning, he helped lead a Know Your Rights workshop for teens. "Listen," Jaylen told the group, "you have the right to ask why you're being stopped. You have the right to stay calm and protect yourself. And if someone crosses the line, don't stay silent. Find someone who will help you be heard." Afterward, a boy shyly raised his hand. "What if no one believes you?" Jaylen smiled softly. The truth doesn't need permission to be real. It just needs to be told. And there will always be someone who listens. Meanwhile, the precinct was slowly shedding its old ways. Officers now participated in regular community engagement programs. Body cam audits became routine, and complaints that would have been buried in paperwork were investigated seriously. The fear in the community was giving way to cautious trust. Yet far from the precinct, Grant lived in quiet isolation. He'd moved out of the city, trying to escape the stares and whispers, but his name was still known. His applications for security jobs were rejected as soon as they ran his background. He couldn't escape the reality that his choices had marked him permanently. Sitting in his small, dim apartment, Grant scrolled through news articles about Angela's summit speech. The headlines framed her as a catalyst for change. He read every word, feeling the weight of how his arrogance had set this entire chain of events in motion. Across town, Angela received a letter in the mail. It was from a woman in another city who had watched her story unfold. "Because of you," the letter read, "I finally had the courage to file a complaint about what happened to my brother. Thank you for reminding us we have power too." Angela placed the letter in a small box where she kept messages like these. not as trophies, but as reminders that every action mattered. That evening, she and Jaylen took a quiet walk through the park. The mural depicting a young boy holding a light in the darkness was now complete. Below it were the words, "Truth doesn't just reveal, it transforms." Jaylen stopped to look at it. "It's strange," he said softly. "Something so bad turned into something that's helping people." Angela nodded. Sometimes change begins in the hardest moments. What matters is what we do with it. Meanwhile, miles away, Grant sat in silence, realizing that while he was forgotten by most, the change he inadvertently triggered was reshaping the world without him. Because once truth steps forward, it doesn't just shine, it keeps moving, leaving those who hid in its shadow behind. As the seasons changed, Angela's story had quietly moved beyond her city. News outlets in other states began covering the reforms that followed her traffic stop, using it as an example of how one incident, when handled with truth and persistence, could spark change far wider than expected. Angela received an invitation from a national civil rights organization to join a panel on systemic reform. At the conference, she sat alongside judges, activists, and community leaders. When it was her turn to speak, she kept her words simple. "I'm not here as a victim. I'm here as a mother, a citizen, and someone who refused to stay silent. What happened to me could have happened to anyone, but I had the privilege of knowing the system, of knowing my rights. Most people don't. That's why it's not enough to punish one officer. We have to fix the culture that enables it." Her words echoed across the room. People stood to applaud, not just for her strength, but for the reminder that change was possible without shouting, without rage, but with unwavering resolve. Back home, Jaylen was finding his own footing. He'd become a quiet mentor at the community center, teaching kids about self-confidence and resilience. One afternoon, after basketball practice, a younger boy asked him, "Do you still think about it? What happened to you?" Jaylen paused, then nodded. "Yeah, but it doesn't control me anymore. It's part of my story, not the whole thing." The boy smiled softly, feeling reassured. Meanwhile, at the precinct, the reforms had taken root. New recruits were shown Angela's case during training as a cautionary tale. They learned that authority wasn't power to abuse, but a responsibility to uphold. Complaints dropped as officers became more conscious of their actions, knowing the community was watching and wouldn't stay silent anymore. For the first time in years, town hall meetings ended not with shouting matches, but with real conversations. Officers and residents sat side by side, planning outreach programs together. But far away, Grant remained trapped in his own quiet downfall. His probation period began after serving a short jail term, but it offered little relief. He struggled to find work, his name permanently stained. Even old acquaintances avoided him. Late one night, scrolling through the news on an old phone, he saw an article about Angela's panel speech. Her face appeared alongside headlines about state-level reforms inspired by her case. Grant turned off the screen and sat in the darkness, realizing that his one moment of arrogance had not only destroyed his life, but reshaped countless others in ways he never intended. Back in the city, Angela and Jaylen attended the unveiling of another mural, this one dedicated to community voices rising after years of silence. It showed a diverse group of basically people holding their heads high with the words, "Justice begins with truth." Jaylen stared at it for a long moment. "It's strange, and that," he said quietly. "If that night never happened, none of this would be here." Angela placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes the hardest moments create the strongest change. It doesn't make what happened right, but it makes what came after meaningful." They walked home through the quiet streets, passing by families enjoying the evening. The city wasn't perfect. There were still problems, still fears, but it was better than it had been. And somewhere, far away, Grant sat in his small apartment, invisible to the world he once believed revolved around him. His name was now just a warning, a lesson whispered in training rooms and community halls. Because when truth takes root, it doesn't just expose one wrong. It grows into something bigger, something lasting. As winter approached, Angela's influence quietly extended beyond her state. Invitations poured in from universities, law schools, and community organizations across the country. They wanted her to speak about accountability, about how a single moment of courage could uncover a deeper truth. At one law school auditorium, students packed every seat to hear her speak. She stood at the podium, composed and humble, addressing a sea of young faces eager to change the future. "I didn't set out to start a movement," Angela began. "I was just a woman driving home, but that night reminded me that silence only helps the wrong people. If you remember one thing from my story, remember this: the law means nothing if it doesn't protect the people it's meant to serve. And you, future lawyers, future leaders, must make sure it does." The audience rose in a quiet standing ovation. Back home, Jaylen was preparing for college applications. He chose to write his personal essay not about the incident itself, but about what it taught him: resilience, community, and the power of truth. His teachers, reading drafts, were moved to tears. "You've turned something painful into something powerful," one teacher told him. "You're showing people that what happens to you doesn't have to define you. It can shape you." Meanwhile, the precinct continued to evolve. Officers now participated in monthly community service programs, not as a formality, but as a way to rebuild trust. Relationships with residents improved. Neighbors who once looked at patrol cars with suspicion now saw familiar faces who treated them with respect. And in training rooms across the state, Angela's traffic stop was shown as a required case study. New recruits watched the footage, then heard discussions about bias, abuse of power, and the importance of de-escalation. "Remember," the instructor told them, "authority doesn't mean superiority, it means responsibility. Lose sight of that, and you lose everything." As for Grant, his life continued to unravel quietly. After his short prison sentence, he moved to a small town far from the city where his name was infamous. But anonymity didn't erase the stain. Every job interview ended the same way: an awkward silence when his background came up, followed by rejection. One night, sitting alone in a dingy apartment, he came across another news article. This one featured Jaylen, now older, smiling as he received a Youth Leadership Award for his community work. The headline read, "Teen who stood against injustice inspires next generation." Grant stared at the photo for a long time. The boy he once tried to intimidate was thriving. and he was nothing, just a footnote in someone else's story. Meanwhile, Angela and Jaylen attended a community celebration at the courthouse plaza. The new oversight board was officially launched, and families gathered to mark the occasion. A young mother approached Angela with her daughter. "Thank you," she said softly. "Because of you, my kids won't grow up thinking no one will listen. You gave us hope." Angela smiled warmly. Hope doesn't come from one person. It comes from all of us refusing to accept less than what's right. As the crowd applauded, Jaylen stood beside his mom, feeling a quiet sense of peace. He no longer felt like just the boy from the viral video. He felt like someone who had survived and found purpose. Later that night, as they walked home under the city lights, Jaylen asked, "Mom, do you think we really made a difference?" Angela looked at him with calm certainty. "Yes, because the truth doesn't end with one moment. It keeps growing, shaping everything around it. And now, it's bigger than both of us." Across the state, reforms were spreading, conversations were shifting, and communities were waking up. And in the shadows, Grant faded further into irrelevance, a reminder that power built on fear never lasts. Because when the truth is set free, it doesn't just change one life. It rewrites the future for everyone it touches. Spring arrived with a gentle warmth that felt like renewal. By now, Jaylen was preparing to graduate from high school. The incident that once defined him had become a piece of his story, not the whole of it. He had learned to carry it without letting it weigh him down. On the day of his graduation ceremony, the auditorium buzzed with excitement. Families filled the seats, clapping and cheering as each name was called. When Jaylen's name echoed through the room, the applause was louder than he expected. He crossed the stage, his diploma in hand, and spotted Olivia in the crowd, smiling proudly, her eyes shining with quiet emotion. After the ceremony, teachers and friends congratulated him. One teacher pulled him aside. "Jaylen, I know this year wasn't easy, but you turned something dark into something that gave hope to a lot of people. You should be proud of that." Jaylen nodded, a small smile forming. "Thanks. I just didn't want it to break me." Meanwhile, Angela's work continued on a larger scale. She was invited to join a statewide task force on police reform, helping draft new policies that required transparency and accountability at every level. During one meeting at the Capitol, lawmakers commended her for her efforts, but she stayed humble. "This isn't about me," she said firmly. "It's about making sure no one else has to go through what my son did. Real justice isn't reactive, it's preventative." Her words were quoted in newspapers across the state. More cities began to adopt oversight boards, and the conversation about bias in policing shifted from defensive denial to constructive action. Back at the precinct, the cultural shift was undeniable. New recruits were paired with community mentors. Officers spent time in schools and neighborhoods, not just patrolling, but listening, connecting. The community no longer saw only uniforms. They saw people who were trying to rebuild trust. And Grant, he had all but disappeared. Living in a small, forgotten town, he kept to himself, taking occasional, odd jobs for cash. He avoided the news, but sometimes he'd catch glimpses of Angela or Jaylen in headlines about reform. Every time, it reminded him that the power he'd abused hadn't just vanished, it had been handed back to the people it truly belonged to. One evening, Jaylen and Angela visited the courthouse plaza where the mural still stood, vibrant and alive. Beneath it, new flowers had been placed, along with handwritten notes from residents thanking them for speaking out. Jaylen ran his fingers lightly over the words painted on the wall. Truth doesn't just reveal, it transforms. It feels different now, he said softly, like it's not just about what happened to me, it's about all the people who needed this to change. Angela nodded. That's exactly it. You were the spark, but the fire belongs to everyone. Later that night, as they walked home, Jaylen looked up at the stars scattered across the sky. Do you think I can help people like you do? Angela smiled, her arm gently looping around his shoulder. You already are, Jay. You've shown people that even when you're scared, standing in the truth makes a difference. That's more powerful than you realize. In the quiet of the night, the city seemed calmer, as if healing slowly. It wasn't perfect. There was still work to do, but it was better than it had been, and miles away, in the stillness of his tiny apartment, Grant stared at the blank walls, knowing the world had moved on without him. His name was now only a cautionary tale in training manuals, while Angela and Jaylen's names had become synonymous with resilience and change because the truth doesn't just close one chapter, it opens the door for a better one. Summer brought new beginnings. Jaylen had been accepted into college, choosing to study criminal justice. It wasn't something he had planned before, but the incident had changed the way he saw the world and his role in it. On his first day at the university orientation, he sat quietly in a lecture hall surrounded by other students. When the professor asked them to share why they chose this path, Jaylen hesitated at first. I guess, he said slowly, I want to make sure the system works the way it's supposed to. I've seen what happens when it doesn't, and I don't want anyone else to go through that. The room went silent for a moment before a few students nodded in understanding. Back home, Angela continued her work with the statewide task force. She met with legislators, police chiefs, and community advocates. They drafted new laws requiring independent investigations for any traffic stop that resulted in a complaint. It wasn't just about punishment anymore. It was about prevention. During one hearing, a senator leaned toward her and said, Your persistence is changing the way we do things, not just here, but across the state. Angela responded simply, It's not persistence for me. It's necessity. This is about people's lives. Meanwhile, the precinct where it all began had transformed. Officers were now required to log every traffic stop with detailed reports, and body cam footage was reviewed weekly by civilian volunteers. Complaints had dropped significantly, not because people stopped caring, but because fewer abuses were happening. And somewhere far away, Grant's life remained stuck in quiet decline. He worked odd jobs to make ends meet, but every time someone recognized his name, doors closed. He couldn't escape what he'd done. Occasionally, he would scroll through the news and see Angela's name attached to another reform, another success. It was a reminder that while his career had ended in disgrace, the people he tried to intimidate were thriving and building a future he could never be part of. One afternoon, Jaylen returned home for the weekend. Angela met him at the door with a warm smile. How's college life? She asked. It's good, he said. smiling faintly. It feels purposeful, like I'm doing something that matters. Angela hugged him tightly. You already did something that matters, but now you get to choose what comes next. That evening, they attended a community event celebrating the success of the new reforms. Families gathered in the park, kids played, while adults shared food and stories. A woman approached Angela, holding a framed photo of her son. He didn't survive his encounter with the police, she said softly. But because of you and Jaylen, I feel like his story is helping others. Thank you. Angela placed a comforting hand on the woman's shoulder. Your son's story will never be forgotten. His life still matters, and it always will. Jaylen watched the exchange, feeling the weight of how far they'd come. He realized the incident that once filled him with fear had become the foundation for something bigger than either of them could have imagined. Later that night, they walked past the courthouse plaza, where the mural of hope still stood tall. More names had been added to its base, names of people who had spoken up, of those who didn't survive, of those whose stories had inspired change. Jaylen stopped and traced his fingers over the words at the bottom. Truth is the seed of justice. He turned to Angela. You think there'll ever be a time when we don't need reminders like this? Angela looked at the mural, then back at him. Maybe not in our lifetime, but every step we take gets us closer. And somewhere, miles away, Grant sat alone in a dim room, the sound of the world moving on, without him echoing louder than any silence he'd ever known. Because the truth doesn't just outlast lies, it rebuilds everything they tried to break. As autumn returned, Jaylen began to truly embrace his purpose. At college, he joined a student advocacy group focused on criminal justice reform. He didn't lead with his own story. He didn't want pity. Instead, he listened, learned, and helped others share their voices. One evening, the group hosted a forum on campus. Students from different backgrounds shared their experiences with profiling and bias. When it was Jaylen's turn to speak, he stood in front of the crowd and took a slow breath. I thought staying quiet would make me safe, he said. I thought if I followed every rule, nothing bad could happen. But I learned that silence doesn't protect you. Truth does. It's hard, and it's scary, but it matters. The room was silent, absorbing his words. Then the applause started, not loud or chaotic, but steady and heartfelt. Meanwhile, Angela's work had reached national recognition. She was invited to Washington, D.C. to consult on a federal initiative for law enforcement accountability. Sitting in a room with senators and policymakers, she shared her perspective with quiet authority. This isn't about punishing officers, she explained. It's about protecting communities and ensuring that the law serves everyone equally. If we want trust, we must earn it. And that starts with transparency. Her testimony was quoted on national news that evening, sparking debates across the country. Civil rights leaders praised her for using her experience to push meaningful, lasting reforms. Back in their city, the changes continued to deepen. Community engagement programs flourished, and the Oversight Board gained the power to review all misconduct cases independently. For the first time, residents felt their complaints were being heard. But far away, Grant's life continued to shrink. He was living in near obscurity now, taking odd labor jobs in a small town where no one knew him, at least until they did. One day, a coworker recognized his name from an article. "You're that cop, aren't you?" the man asked. Grant didn't answer. He just packed his things and left, knowing he couldn't escape his past. His name wasn't just forgotten, it was remembered for all the wrong reasons. Meanwhile, Jaylen returned home for a weekend visit. Angela met him at the door with her usual warm smile, but she noticed something new in his eyes: calm confidence. "I spoke at the forum this week," he told her. "How did it feel?" she asked. He paused. "It felt right, like maybe my story can help someone else find their voice." Angela's eyes softened with pride. "It already is." Later that night, they attended a community gathering at the courthouse plaza. The mural had grown. New faces and names were added to its design, representing all the stories that had fueled change. Beneath it, a new plaque was unveiled, dedicated to those who turned pain into purpose. Angela stood quietly, taking it in. Beside her, Jaylen ran his fingers across the engraved words. "This doesn't feel like just my story anymore," he said softly. "It isn't," Angela replied. "It belongs to everyone who ever felt powerless and chose to speak anyway." As they walked back under the glowing city lights, they felt a quiet peace. The work wasn't finished. Change never was. But the path ahead was clearer than ever. And somewhere in the silence of a forgotten apartment, Grant stared at the ceiling, realizing that while his actions had destroyed his own future, they had unintentionally sparked hope for countless others. Because truth, once unleashed, doesn't stop at one moment. It spreads, reshaping the world long after the noise fades. Winter settled over the city, but the momentum from Angela and Jaylen's story didn't slow. Across the state, new legislation requiring body cameras, transparent reporting, and mandatory community training for officers was signed into law. News anchors credited the reforms to the case that started with one unjust traffic stop. Angela was invited to testify before a congressional committee on law enforcement accountability. She sat in the grand chamber under bright lights, facing senators and representatives. Cameras flashed, but she didn't flinch. "I am not here because I want recognition," she said clearly. "I'm here because what happened to me is happening to people who don't have the platform to speak. If we want a future where communities trust the law, we must build systems that deserve that trust." Her words were broadcast nationally, replayed on countless channels. Commentators praised her composure and the clarity of her message. Back home, Jaylen's advocacy grew in quiet but powerful ways. He started a small mentorship group on campus called Voices Rising, where students from the marginalized communities could share their experiences and learn about their rights. During one session, a first-year student admitted, "I didn't think anyone would listen to me if something happened. But hearing you, it makes me feel like maybe I don't have to stay quiet." Jaylen smiled. "You don't, and if you speak, you won't be alone." Meanwhile, the precinct where it all began had transformed almost completely. Officers who resisted the new standards were gone, replaced by those willing to embrace change. Civilian oversight now reviewed every complaint in real time. Neighborhood patrols were paired with community liaisons. For the first time, trust between residents and officers wasn't just a promise, it was becoming reality, and Grant, he had all but vanished. Living under an assumed quiet life in a distant town, he kept his head down, avoiding conversation. His name, once flashing across headlines, was now a forgotten cautionary tale in training rooms and law school discussions. One night, he sat alone in his small, cold apartment. A faint news report played on the old TV in the corner. Angela was being honored with a national award for public service. Jaylen stood beside her, smiling, now seen as a young leader in his own right. Grant turned off the TV. He didn't want to see how the people he tried to intimidate were thriving while he sat in the silence of his failure. Meanwhile, Angela and Jaylen attended a ceremony at the city hall where the mayor unveiled a new initiative named the Brooks Accountability Act, dedicated to ensuring no traffic stop could escalate without proper oversight. The crowd applauded as the mayor spoke. This isn't just a policy change, it's a promise. A promise that every person in this city will be treated with dignity. Afterward, community members approached Angela, thanking her. Jaylen stood nearby, humbled and quiet, realizing that their story was no longer just theirs. It belonged to everyone who had been unheard. That evening, they walked past the courthouse plaza where the mural had a new addition. Angela's badge, painted alongside a line of text that read, "Courage doesn't always shout. Sometimes it simply refuses to be silent." Jaylen looked at it and smiled. "It doesn't feel like the end anymore," he said softly. Angela nodded. "Because it isn't. It's the beginning of something better." As the cold winter air brushed past them, the city lights glowed brighter than before. Change wasn't perfect, but it was real. And miles away, in a forgotten corner of the state, Grant sat alone with nothing but the echo of his choices. Because truth doesn't just defeat lies, it builds a future where they have no place to grow. By spring, Angela's work had extended far beyond their state. She was now consulting with multiple jurisdictions across the country, helping shape policies on traffic stops, officer training, and civilian oversight. What began as a single, unjust encounter had become the blueprint for nationwide reform discussions. At a national summit in Chicago, she stood alongside federal officials and community leaders. Cameras flashed as she spoke. Change doesn't come from one law, one firing, or one protest. It comes from a collective promise. A promise that every person deserves dignity and every badge must be held accountable. This isn't just about me. It's about everyone who didn't get the chance to speak. Her words drew a standing ovation. Yet Angela remained humble, stepping off the stage quietly while others praised her impact. Meanwhile, Jaylen was finishing his first year of college. He had become a trusted mentor on campus, someone younger students turned to when they needed advice. His group, Voices Rising, had grown to include dozens of members who were organizing workshops in local schools. During one meeting, a student asked, "Do you ever wish none of it happened? That night, I mean?" Jaylen paused. "Yeah, I wish it never happened. But since it did, I'm glad it turned into something that helps people. That's what keeps me going." Back in their hometown, the police department had undergone a cultural transformation. Officers were now required to spend time in community service, attend quarterly training on bias and de-escalation, and participate in regular meetings with residents. It wasn't perfect, but the fear that once hung over every traffic stop was beginning to lift. Meanwhile, Grant's existence had faded into complete irrelevance. In a small, forgotten apartment, He kept his blinds drawn, avoiding even casual conversation with neighbors. His past followed him wherever he went. Even when he tried applying for basic jobs, his name would eventually surface in background checks. Employers would hesitate, then quietly withdraw their offers. One night, he turned on the TV just in time to see Angela being honored at a national awards ceremony for her contributions to justice reform. Jaylen stood beside her, taller now, speaking confidently about youth leadership. Grant stared at the screen. The boy he had once tried to intimidate was thriving, while he was left in a void of his own making. He turned the TV off, unable to face the reality that his one moment of cruelty had built the platform for their triumph. Back in the city, a new community center was opened, named after victims of unjust policing. Angela and Jaylen attended the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Kids ran through the halls, laughing, unaware of the pain that had built the walls now protecting them. A young girl approached Jaylen shyly. "My mom says you're the reason this place exists. Thank you." Jaylen smiled, crouching to her level. "You're welcome. But remember, it's not just because of me. It's because a lot of people stood together to make it happen." That evening, Angela and Jaylen returned to the courthouse plaza. The mural had grown even more, now spanning an entire wall, with faces and names of people whose stories had sparked change. Jaylen gazed at it quietly. "It feels bigger than us now." Angela nodded. "That's how you know it worked. It's no longer about what happened to us. It's about what comes next for everyone else." They stood together under the soft glow of the streetlights, knowing the journey wasn't over, but feeling peace in how far they had come. And miles away, in the silence of his lonely apartment, Grant sat with the heavy realization that the power he once abused had been reclaimed, rebuilt, and redirected into something he could never undo. Because the truth doesn't just outlive lies, it replaces them with something stronger. Summer brought with it a new wave of recognition. Angela's work with national policymakers had begun to bear fruit. A federal bill, inspired by cases like hers, was introduced in Congress to mandate stricter protocols for traffic stops, increased transparency, and federal oversight for repeated misconduct in local departments. Angela was invited to stand beside senators as the bill was announced. She didn't speak much. She didn't need to. Her presence alone was a reminder of what happens when power is abused, and what can happen when truth refuses to be silenced. Back home, Jaylen continued his studies while balancing his growing advocacy work. He was invited to speak at a youth leadership summit, where students from across the country gathered. Standing on stage, he shared his journey with quiet strength. "I didn't choose what happened to me," he said, "but I chose how to respond. And I learned that one voice, even a scared one, can start something bigger. But the real change happens when we all speak together." The audience erupted in applause. Afterward, students lined up to thank him. One boy told him, "You make me feel like I don't have to be afraid anymore." Meanwhile, in their hometown, the community center named after victims of unjust policing was thriving. It offered mentorship programs, legal aid workshops, and safe spaces for dialogue between officers and residents. The walls were covered in artwork created by local youth, each piece symbolizing resilience and hope. Angela visited often, sitting quietly with parents who were still processing their own painful encounters with the system. She listened, offered guidance, and reminded them that their voices mattered too. Meanwhile, the precinct had become almost unrecognizable compared to what it once was. Officers were now evaluated not just on enforcement, but on community engagement and trust building. Civilian review panels had the power to remove officers who failed to uphold the new standards, and somewhere far from the city, Grant lived in obscurity. He had moved again, trying to escape the whispers that followed him. But no matter how far he went, he couldn't outrun his past. His name would appear in an online search, tied to the viral video and the reforms it triggered. Occasionally, he would catch news about Angela and Jaylen. He saw their faces, hers calm and resolute, his filled with a quiet pride, and it reminded him of what he had lost. Not just a job, but any semblance of respect. One evening, Angela and Jaylen returned to the courthouse plaza for a special gathering. The city was unveiling a new monument alongside the mural, dedicated to community voices that sparked change. The mayor spoke briefly, but then stepped aside to let Angela address the crowd. She stood before them, her voice clear and steady. This monument isn't about one story. It's about all the stories that were ignored for too long. It's a promise that we will keep fighting for a better, safer, and fairer future. Not just for us, but for everyone who comes after. Jaylen stood beside her, feeling a surge of pride, not for himself, but for what the moment represented. After the ceremony, a little girl tugged at his sleeve. "I want to be brave like you when I grow up," she said. Jaylen crouched down, smiling softly. "You already are," he told her. As they walked home that evening, Angela looked at her son, now taller, wiser, and stronger than the boy who had once been pulled over on a quiet street. "You've come so far," she said quietly. Jaylen nodded. "We both have." And miles away, Grant sat alone, staring at the muted TV screen showing the monument dedication. He turned it off, unable to face the reality that his one moment of cruelty had built a legacy of change he could never undo. Because truth doesn't just survive, it thrives, even when those who tried to bury it are long forgotten. As autumn rolled in, Angela's influence had firmly taken root nationwide. The federal bill she helped shape was now gaining bipartisan support, and several states had already adopted key provisions: mandatory body cam reviews, independent oversight boards, and stricter penalties for misconduct. She traveled often now, speaking at forums and meeting with lawmakers. Yet, no matter how far her work reached, she always returned home, grounding herself in the quiet moments with Jaylen. Meanwhile, Jaylen was thriving in college. His group, Voices Rising, had expanded beyond campus. They began hosting online workshops for students across the country, teaching them about their rights and how to advocate for themselves. The group's motto was simple: silence protects no one. During one of the online sessions, a student from another state said, "I never thought someone my age could make a difference. Hearing your story, it makes me believe I can too." Jaylen smiled warmly. "You can. Change doesn't start big. It starts with one voice, then another, and another." Back in their hometown, the community center was buzzing with life. Officers now visited regularly, not for enforcement, but for conversation. They played basketball with kids, joined workshops, and listened to the concerns of residents. The tension that had once defined their relationship with the community had begun to fade. At the precinct, the chief walked through the hallways, proud of the transformation. What had once been a fractured department was now becoming an example for others. This is how it should have always been, he told his staff during a meeting. Meanwhile, far away, Grant's life remained a shadow of what it once was. The man who had once wielded a badge like a weapon now lived quietly, unseen, unwanted. He worked small, temporary jobs that required no background checks. But even there, the whispers followed when someone inevitably recognized his name. One evening, he sat in the dim glow of his apartment, watching a news segment on Angela and Jaylen. They stood together at a national youth summit, surrounded by applause. Grant stared blankly, realizing he was now nothing more than the reason their movement had begun. A forgotten villain in a story of resilience. Back in the city, Angela and Jaylen returned to the courthouse plaza for an anniversary vigil. The mural had grown even larger, now stretching across an entire block with faces and words of hope and justice. Beneath it, another plaque had been added, dedicated to those who turned injustice into change. Jaylen traced the words with his fingers. "It doesn't feel like my story anymore," he said softly. Angela nodded. "Because it's everyone's story now. That's the power of truth. It doesn't stay small. It spreads." After the vigil, they walked home through the cool autumn air. Jaylen glanced at his mom, realizing how much she had done, not just for him, but for so many others. "You know," he said quietly, "you didn't just protect me. You protected a lot of people you'll never even meet." Angela smiled. "And you gave them hope. That's what really matters." As they reached their home, the city skyline glowing in the distance, Jaylen felt a deep sense of peace. What began as a terrifying moment in his life had become a bridge for change, change that would outlast both of them. And miles away, in his lonely apartment, Grant stared at the blank walls, consumed by the reality that the world had moved forward without him. He wasn't feared anymore. He wasn't respected. He was simply forgotten, except as a lesson. Because the truth doesn't just expose darkness, it replaces it with light that keeps spreading, long after the moment has passed. By the time spring returned again, Jaylen had grown into his role as both a student and an advocate. Voices Rising, the mentorship program he started on campus, had expanded into a national network. They partnered with schools, community centers, and youth organizations to teach young people about their rights, self-advocacy, and how to build bridges between communities and law enforcement. At a large youth conference in Atlanta, Jaylen stood on stage in front of hundreds of students from across the country. His voice, once unsure, was now confident and steady. "I'm not here because I wanted attention," he said. "I'm here because something unfair happened to me, and I realized the only way to stop it from happening again was to speak. Each of you has that same power. You don't have to wait for permission to be heard." The audience erupted in applause, some students even standing. Afterward, many lined up to thank him, telling him how his journey inspired them to share their own experiences. Meanwhile, Angela was recognized nationally for her contributions to law enforcement reform. At a formal ceremony in Washington, D.C., she was honored with a public service award for justice and integrity. She stood at the podium with quiet humility, looking out at lawmakers, activists, and fellow advocates. "This isn't my award," she said softly. "It belongs to everyone who refused to stay silent. My son's story started with fear, but it ended with hope. And that hope belongs to all of us." Her words were broadcast across the country, reminding people that lasting change is built on persistence, not anger alone. Back in their city, the community center continued to thrive. Children played in safe spaces. Families attended workshops on knowing their rights, and officers volunteered regularly, forging genuine relationships with the people they served. What had once been a fractured community was now an example of what healing could look like. At the precinct, a new generation of officers was being trained under reformed policies. During orientation, they were shown Angela's traffic stop video, not as a piece of shame, but as a lesson. "Remember this," the instructor told them. "This is what happens when power goes unchecked. Your badge doesn't make you untouchable. It makes you responsible." Meanwhile, Grant's life remained stagnant. He lived in a small, aging apartment complex, taking whatever odd jobs he could find. No one looked at him with fear anymore. There was no respect left, only quiet pity or disdain. One night, he turned on the TV to see yet another segment about Angela and Jaylen. They were standing together at a national youth summit, smiling as they announced a scholarship fund for students pursuing law and community leadership. Grant watched silently, realizing he was now just a forgotten shadow in their story, a man whose arrogance had built the platform for their triumph. Back home, after the summit, Angela and Jaylen sat on their porch, the evening calm and peaceful. "You've become everything you were meant to be," Angela said softly, looking at her son. Jaylen smiled. "So have you. You turned what happened into something that helps people every day." Angela reached over, squeezing his hand gently. "We did it together, son." The city lights glowed in the distance, and the faint sound of laughter drifted from the community center down the street. Change wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was lasting, because the truth they refused to bury had not only reshaped their lives, but had given countless others the courage to rise. And miles away, Grant sat alone, staring at the muted TV screen, knowing that while his name had faded into irrelevance, the truth he tried to silence had become a force too powerful to ever erase. By the next year, Jaylen had fully stepped into the role of a national youth advocate. What started as a small campus group had now turned into a recognized organization with chapters in multiple states. Voices Rising hosted virtual town halls, community workshops, and school programs, empowering thousands of young people to understand their rights and speak out against injustice. At a major conference in New York City, Jaylen was invited as the keynote speaker. Standing in a vast auditorium filled with students, educators, and activists, he spoke with calm conviction. "I never wanted to be known for what happened to me," he said, "but I realized that my silence would only help those who hurt me. So I spoke. And now, all of you can speak too. Change doesn't belong to one person. It belongs to all of us." The crowd gave him a standing ovation, not because he was a victim, but because he had turned his pain into purpose. Meanwhile, Angela's reforms had gone even further. The federal bill she helped shape was now law. Departments nationwide were required to have independent civilian oversight boards, mandatory de-escalation training, and transparent reporting of every traffic stop. She was traveling less now, but her work had left an undeniable legacy. One afternoon, she received a call from a mother in another state. "My daughter was stopped unfairly last month," the woman said, her voice shaky. "Because of the new laws your work inspired, the officer was investigated and removed. I just wanted to thank you for protecting people you'll never even meet." Angela smiled faintly, holding back emotion. "That's why we did it. So your daughter, and every daughter, can feel safer." Back in their hometown, the transformation was still visible. The community center had expanded, offering legal aid and scholarships for local youth. Officers now worked hand in hand with residents, creating trust that once seemed impossible. Even the precinct culture had changed completely. During training sessions, instructors reminded recruits of the past. "Respect is not optional," one instructor told them. "Abuse of power destroys everything. Learn from the mistakes that brought reform here. Don't repeat them." And far away, Grant remained in quiet exile. He'd tried to apply for work outside of law enforcement, but every interview ended the same way. The past followed him like a shadow. He kept his head down, living in a small, forgotten town. No one looked at him with authority anymore. He was just a cautionary tale, reduced to a single sentence in lectures and news articles. Late one night, he scrolled through the news and saw Angela and Jaylen smiling together at a national event, announcing a scholarship fund for aspiring lawyers and community leaders. He stared at the photo for a long time, realizing he was the reason their story began. But he would never be part of the hope it created. Back home, Angela and Jaylen attended the unveiling of a new section of the mural. It depicted young people holding hands, stepping forward toward a brighter horizon. At the bottom were the words, "From one voice comes many." Jaylen looked at it quietly. "It's bigger than anything I ever imagined," he said softly. Angela nodded. "Because it stopped being just about us a long time ago. It belongs to everyone now." That evening, as they walked through the calm streets, the city felt alive with possibility. Change wasn't just a promise anymore. It was happening, piece by piece, in every conversation, every law, every young person who refused to stay silent. And in the stillness of his lonely apartment, Grant faced the truth he could no longer escape. The power he once abused had been reclaimed and turned into something lasting, something he could never destroy. Because truth doesn't just echo, it builds a future that outlives the lies. Months later, the story of Angela and Jaylen had become part of a larger national conversation. Schools across the country used their experience as a case study in civics classes. Universities invited Jaylen to speak about resilience and advocacy, while Angela's name appeared in policy papers and legal journals as a key voice in reshaping accountability laws. At a national leadership summit in Washington, Jaylen stood alongside other young advocates who had turned their pain into progress. He listened as one student shared how seeing his viral story gave her courage to report her own unjust encounter. When it was his turn to speak, he stepped forward with quiet confidence. "I didn't think anyone would believe me that day," he said, "but the truth didn't need me to be loud. It just needed me to speak. You don't have to be fearless to make change." You just have to refuse to stay silent." The audience gave a standing ovation. Several students approached him afterward, saying they felt braver just hearing his words. Meanwhile, Angela had taken on an advisory role with a federal justice council. She no longer traveled as much, but focused on building sustainable reform programs in multiple states. Through her efforts, dozens of cities created oversight committees, passed bias training mandates, and enacted policies ensuring no traffic stop could go unreviewed. During a televised interview, the host asked, "Did you ever imagine that one traffic stop could create this much change?" Angela smiled faintly. "I didn't imagine it, and I didn't want it. But if something unjust happens to you, you have two choices. You can let it end with you, or you can use it to stop it from happening again." We chose the second. Back in their hometown, the community center had become a hub of hope. Children laughed in the playrooms, teenagers attended workshops about their rights, and officers volunteered to mentor youth. The once divided neighborhood now felt like a family rebuilding itself, and far away, Grant's life had faded into quiet obscurity. He lived in a rundown apartment, surviving on odd jobs. No one treated him with respect anymore. He no longer carried the weight of authority, only the heavy shadow of what he had lost. One evening, he flipped through the TV channels and saw a segment about the federal reforms inspired by Angela's case. Jaylen appeared on screen, older now, speaking confidently about empowering the next generation. Grant turned off the TV, unable to watch any longer. The people he tried to intimidate had built something lasting from his failure, while he remained trapped in his own irrelevance. Meanwhile, Angela and Jaylen attended another mural unveiling, this one outside the new youth center funded by the National Scholarship Program they started. The mural showed a line of people standing together, their silhouettes merging into one another like a single unified voice. At the bottom, it read, "Truth outlives fear." Jaylen stood silently, taking it in. "It feels like we're finally free from that night," he said quietly. Angela looked at him, her eyes warm. "We are, and because of you, others will be too." As they walked back through the plaza, families passed by, smiling, children running and laughing without fear. The city wasn't perfect, but it was better, stronger. And in the stillness of his lonely room, Grant realized that the power he once abused had been taken back, not with anger, but with truth, resilience, and a courage that couldn't be silenced. Because when truth takes root, it doesn't stop growing. It becomes a legacy. Spring arrived once more, but this time it felt different. The city that had once been fractured now carried a quiet strength. Streets that once held tension now echoed with the sounds of children playing and neighbors greeting one another. The community center had become a cornerstone, offering mentorship, legal aid, and a space where people could simply feel safe. Angela and Jaylen stood on the steps of the new National Center for Community Justice, a project they had helped inspire. It was the culmination of years of work, federal reforms, statewide initiatives, and countless community efforts rolled into one permanent legacy. During the opening ceremony, the mayor addressed the crowd. "This center exists because one woman refused to stay silent, and one young man turned his fear into purpose. Their story reminded us that the law is only as strong as the people who demand it serve everyone equally. Applause filled the plaza. Angela smiled softly, but stepped aside, preferring not to take the spotlight. Then Jaylen took the podium. He looked out at the crowd, students, parents, officers, community leaders, and people from all over the country who had traveled to witness this moment. "I never wanted to be defined by what happened that night," he began, "but I've learned that sometimes the hardest moments can build the strongest change. This center isn't about me or my mom. It's about all of you. It's about making sure no one ever feels alone, unheard, or powerless again." The audience rose in a standing ovation, some wiping tears from their eyes. Meanwhile, the precinct that once failed its community had become a national model. Officers now partnered with local leaders to create programs that built trust. Annual reports were made public. Complaints were handled swiftly and transparently. For the first time in years, people felt their voices truly mattered. And far from all the celebration, in a dim apartment in another state, Grant sat alone. He watched snippets of the ceremony on the news, the smiling faces, the laughter, the hope. His name was never mentioned anymore, except in training manuals and lectures as an example of what happens when power is abused. He turned off the TV, the silence in his room heavier than ever. The world had moved forward without him, leaving him as nothing more than a forgotten reminder of the past. Later that evening, Angela and Jaylen returned to the courthouse plaza where the original mural still stood. Now, it was part of a larger art installation with hundreds of names of those who had spoken out against injustice. Jaylen traced the newest words engraved on the wall. "Truth doesn't just survive, it leads." He turned to Angela. "It doesn't feel like my story anymore. It feels like everyone's story now." Angela nodded, her voice soft. "That's how you know it worked. It became bigger than us." They stood in silence for a moment, watching as children played nearby and families walked without fear. Jaylen took a deep breath. "I think I'm ready for what's next. Maybe law school. Maybe running Voices Rising full-time. I want to keep helping." Angela smiled proudly. "Whatever you choose, you'll make a difference. You already have." As they walked away from the plaza, the city lights shimmered, reflecting the quiet resilience of a community that had been hurt but refused to stay broken. What started with a single traffic stop, a moment of arrogance and bias, had transformed into a legacy of accountability, education, and hope. And miles away, Grant remained alone with his thoughts, a silent witness to the truth he could never erase. Because in the end, truth doesn't just outlast lies. It builds a future where those lies have no place to grow.